Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of Birmingham City Council's Digital Leaders Week webinars. And in this session, you'll hear from two key speakers. Sitting remotely, we have Raj Mack, Head of Digital Innovation and Partnerships, and you'll also hear from our Commercial Director, Emma Coles. I know they are eager to speak to you and eager to answer any of your questions that you have too. And if you have a question, please feel free to post it into the chat, and then we'll have a look at those during the dedicated Q&A. And if you could let us know who the question is aimed at, that would help with it as well. We're going to hear first from Raj Mack, though, Head of Digital Innovation and Partnerships at Birmingham City Council. So, Raj, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everybody to our showcase about how we approach digital inclusion across the city. Just to say, one of the things that we've done really differently around our approach was making sure that this was a city approach in terms of how we address digital exclusion across the city. Next slide, please. And although we called it digital inclusion, I've got to say this is not about digital. For us, our approach was all about inequalities and making sure that what we did supported our most vulnerable citizens, made sure that we created the opportunities that many of our people in our city have grown to use, expect, and we wanted to make sure that level of inequality was addressed as part of our approach. So this program, although it talks about digital, was really about ensuring that we improve that level of inequality, and we made sure there was access both to digital services, connectivity and skills part of that approach. We wanted to make sure that the council played the right role in doing this. It wasn't our role to go out into the community and start developing courses, training and activities. Our role was to really act as that convener to make sure we worked with the expertise out there and those organisations did great things and made sure we supported them in that convening role. And thirdly, one of the most important things for us was to ensure that this wasn't seen as a siloed digital inclusion project that sat alone while everything else happened. We took a deliberate approach to make sure that our approach on digital inclusion included and was incorporated in other strategies of the city to make sure that it is embedded across our approach across all our different silos. And we addressed not just the digital aspects, but digital poverty as well as closing that inequality gap. Next slide, please. So in taking forward our approach, we did some research, and it was important for us to understand what was going on, understand it both at the national, regional and our local level. And, you know, it's surprisingly that at different levels, it told us different stories about what the city was. For example, at the national level, according to ONS stats and Lloyd's consumer report, Birmingham was better than the national average in terms of its digital inclusion capabilities. So that gave us a bit of a dilemma, really. So do we need to intervene when we are already well included according to the national statistics? However, when we started taking a deeper dive into looking at what the situation on the ground was and what the lived experience was, it gave us a very different picture in terms of where we were at the city and the needs of our citizens. So some of these points here with some of the reflections that we found at a local level. And really, we recognise that there was some really excellent work going on. There were different organisations from the public, private, voluntary, and even the academic sector, all doing various activities to support digital capabilities across the city. We knew there was lots of different work going around digital skills, which is really good to see. And digital skills are all different types of levels, from the real basics to the more advanced things like coding and stuff like that, which we believe is all part of the digital inclusion family. And there were some really good initiatives set up during COVID, and that was really down to some of the sort of forward-thinking private sector organisations and even some of the universities who really ramped up some of their programs to support the most vulnerable across the place. But on the negative side, what we realised was that there was lots of work that was going on that was uncoordinated, it was siloed, and there was lack of visibility of the various things that different organisations were doing, and it made that opportunity to work together very, very difficult. That also demonstrated that there were no clear pathways for people to understand how they connect and develop their digital story and digital capability. That journey was often fragmented. It would provide courses that were very specific to a particular activity, but it didn't provide the signposting, the capabilities to move you on to the next step. And it didn't really take on board what your outcome was going to be, what you wanted to achieve as a citizen, to understand what digital would mean for you and how you can make sure you make the most of those opportunities. And not surprisingly, the other big thing that came out was certainly during the pandemic there was that big issue around connectivity and lack of devices. That was one of the big stifling blocks that really showcased how a lot of the skill-based opportunities disappeared because there were no devices, or the level of connectivity just stopped a lot of those training capabilities, both from an organizational point of view and from a citizen point of view. So recognizing really from that sort of deep dive that our services weren't joined up, our online services weren't joined up, and there was a bit of duplication and mirrored services across different providers, and that some of the funding was sporadic and it was really targeted specific things rather than a holistic approach to how we can make a systemic change in the way citizens embrace digital technologies. And on the right hand side, what you really see is some further deep dive into one of our neighborhoods. So if you bear in mind that our national statistics showed that there was about less than 8% of people who were digitally excluded across the city, the stark reality from our neighborhood was that there was more than 14 to 20% of people had no access to the internet at all. About 50% were actually sharing access with different people and different organizations. A lot of them, up to 40%, said they needed support in understanding how to use those connectivities and those devices. And even from an organizational point of view, a real recognition of all our organizations that was providing a lot of this training needed support to understand some of the basic technologies that the internet was offering. Next slide, please. So we wanted to get a better understanding of what digital exclusion actually meant. We realized this is not a linear process where you're connected and therefore you are digitally included. That is not the case, and that has certainly been proven in some of our findings. So we recognize that digital exclusion is complex and it is multifaceted, and there are different levels of exclusion as well. It's not, as I say, not just black and white. And listed there are probably some of the main areas that we all have got to recognize over the last couple of years. But it is about affordability of devices and those connectivity costs. That is acting as a significant barrier. It's about the skills gap and the means to do it. And that's not just the ability to turn on and do an internet search. It's about the whole thing about how young people do searches about job, how they fill applications. All those things are part of that exclusion. It's about having access to the internet and devices, and that motivation and confidence to understand and feel safe in being able to use the internet in a safe way. And that one of the big things that came out certainly in the last year or so was this issue about trust and fear of crime. Am I safe going online? If I haven't got the experience, if I haven't got the knowledge, do I not do this because I don't know what's going to happen to me and all my data might be stolen? So those are the type of things that we really wanted to go out and try and address. And again, just to reinforce the idea, just having an internet connection at home does not make you digitally included. And that's a real issue. And certainly over the period of the pandemic, we noted that people didn't have the right devices, their data packages were limited. If you had a family with more than 2 or 3 kids in there, they were often sharing one device, and that made the whole home working opportunities very difficult, and obviously left lots of kids in a really disadvantaged position. So my first real challenge around this is we do need to consider how we look at how digital inclusion is measured. It is at the moment too much of a linear process. We need to take on board all the different nuances of digital exclusion and make sure when we are measuring that, we take those on board. And that's a real challenge back to how we're doing this at a national level. And we do need to recognize that because technology evolves so fast, and we've all seen it in our statistics and our research in the last few years, technology moves so quickly, and you could be digitally included today, but certainly as technology evolves, you could be missing out again on all the skills, capabilities and new opportunities that come in. So we need to make sure that digital inclusion is about a holistic approach and an ongoing approach, and not a you're included and that's it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that we had a good understanding of where digital inclusion or exclusion rested, or where it was across the city. That was really difficult to do. We found that a lot of organisations, a lot of our neighbourhoods, our wards, our districts didn't do any surveys, didn't do any activities to know who our local communities, so what kind of interventions we needed to do and how we didn't. So what we've been doing is working with the combined authority and helping develop this capabilities. So they've developed this MIP, which is starting to map out some of the things that are happening across the city and the region. So it's identifying where the courses are taking place. It's identifying where some of the broadband capabilities and where the hotspots and not spots are. It's identifying those areas of deprivation. And yes, they're not going to tell us exactly who are digitally excluded, but it's giving us a proxy to identify those areas and the types of areas that we need to intervene and the types of actions we need to take in those areas. So it's a good starting point. At the top, you'll see the URL for this site, and it's open to anybody to be able to look at that site and play with that to understand how it maps out and how this tool could potentially be replicated in your region as well. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do was really take an approach that was of the city, that involved the city partners, that involved them being part of the solution, rather than here's a city council, we're going to write a strategy, go away and deliver this. That was never going to be our approach. So what we started to do is bring those city partners together. Together with them, we helped create a vision that sat with them, one that they shared and one that they wanted to be part of. And we developed our digital inclusion strategy. Again, there's a link there to our digital inclusion strategy, which we can share in the chat as well. That gives you an idea of the breadth of work that was done to develop that strategy. Next slide, please. So just to emphasize the approach we adopted, and this was very much a first city-wide strategy that we developed. In the past, that the strategies have been developed in the council with some consultation with citizens and organisations. We really flipped that on the head this time, and we made sure it was led through our citizens, through our key organisations, and they helped us develop what should be in an action plan, what should be being developed, and we held some meetings, and this was at the time of COVID, so it was really difficult to get a lot of these people together, get them to work collectively, but they were really willing, and they really sort of stepped up to the mark to help us shape what this could look like. We engaged with over 70 stakeholders across it, and we even had the Good Things Foundation that actually facilitated some of our meetings, that showed that they believed in what we were doing, and this was really making a difference in the approach that we adopted. We made sure that we socialized all of our pieces of work. We had an open platform where people could go in at any time, provide input to us, provide feedback, put forward new ideas, and take ownership of some of the actions that were done. So a really open, collaborative approach in terms of how it was being developed and making sure there was ownership. And yes, absolutely, we had huge amounts of energy in the room and lots of buy-in and lots of enthusiasm from the organisations that wanted to be part of this. So collectively, we identified a number of key things that should be included in the action plan, and that included making sure that we were joined up in our approach. And when I mean joined up, that is a real joining up of the public, private, voluntary sector and university and academic organisations to come together to see collectively how we can actually approach this. So we're not making spot changes, but we're creating a systemic approach in terms of how we can really make a transformational change, and one that will be sustainable moving forward. We wanted to make sure that social value was built into this, and those social value opportunities, working with huge amounts of organisation as the City Council does, make sure we get the best of those opportunities and make sure those are built in. We wanted to improve digital literacy as well as skills capabilities. So it wasn't just about accessing, it wasn't just about connectivity. It's about people understanding the language, the issues, and the opportunities to use and make the most of that capability. Clearly, devices was something that we had to address, and affordability, and my colleague Emma will talk a little bit more about some of the things we've done around that, and making sure that what we provided was accessible and had the right accessibility was hugely important, and that our programs ensured that we brought and helped people to develop their motivation and their confidence, and remove some of the elements of mistrust they had and the security concerns that they had about addressing some of these things. Next slide, please. So in taking that opportunity forward, we've identified 7 key areas that we really wanted to do. So one around governance. It was really important that we had the right governance across the city, that we made sure that the right partners were there and they were talking, and there was a a coalition of the willing that coming together, so we had a sense of direction and we had a sense of ownership about what we wanted to do. The second area was scoping the challenge, and scoping that challenge was really important because we wanted to make sure that we are targeting the right people, the right organisations, then we can make localised and hyper local activities in those interventions in those areas, rather than taking a blanket approach and just providing our services whoever shouting later. We wanted that to be an intelligence-led and evidence-led approach. Inclusivity was obviously important to us, so we've been working with our external partners, working with other structures of the city to make sure that digital inclusion is embedded and part and parcel of those activities. So things like financial inclusion is aligned to our digital inclusion, our customer services program, and working with other universities and other organisations to embed digital inclusion capabilities as part of the role that they will play. Building capacity is about supporting our citizens, recognizing that there is huge amounts of work already there, building on their capabilities and creating things like digital champions, digital champion networks to support that bottom-up approach to enable greater facilitation and greater access to those most vulnerable people. Connectivity was a huge issue, and we've been exploring plans about how we can improve connectivity across the city. That's including connectivity to our most vulnerable in social housing, ensuring all our libraries have free Wi-Fi to connect into, and exploring other ways to creating free Wi-Fi hotspots within the community so those people can access that at the time that they need, rather than at times when access may be limited. Building capabilities, and that's the City Council investing, making sure that we are providing support to this programme and the communities out there. And that funding, we know there's lots of different funding, sometimes small, sometimes large, and our opportunity really here was to bring some of those organisations together, look at those funding pots and see how well we can actually bring those different organisations together in a way of creating an opportunity that enables us to have a more of a systemic approach and more sustainable approach in some of the activities that we develop. Next slide, please. So as part of the action plan, what we've done is identified some quick early wins, and this is part of the longer roadmap. And I just wanted to highlight some of the activities here that we've already started doing. We've already set up a team, a dedicated digital inclusion team on that governance, and we've set up a governance board that brings together some of the leading national organisations, local organisations, and voluntary sector organisations to work together to look at our roadmap and take ownership and see how they can develop some of the opportunities around that. And that's already started, and we've started that process in terms of identifying actions and activities that we can do collectively together. We've already started creating that digital inclusion map, and some of the work that we've done around with the combined authority on creating that map to identify as a proxy of where we need to intervene. We've made sure that we are building our digital inclusion into our strategies and policies. Next slide, please. And clearly we're trying to build that capacity. So we've already invested in a 2-year program with staff appointed to it to make that happen. And we've made sure there is free Wi-Fi in all our libraries so that people can drop in and use some of those. Connectivity, we've done lots of work around connectivity, and that continues to grow around some of the opportunities. And Emma will talk a little bit about some of the work we've done around devices and connectivity. And we've also set up a loan scheme within the council to work with external partners to provide that additional capacity so that we can continue people to have access to devices and opportunities that they wouldn't normally have. And education, and our education is now offering free digital services along with maths and English as part and parcel of that free service we're providing, and we continue to work with organisations through that funding opportunity. Next slide, please. This is just a summary of the roadmap, and the reason I've showed this, and when you have a look at the actual strategy, this is contained there. This sets out some of our ambitions for the action plan, and the thing this is really important is that most of our organisations that we work with are all helping us develop some of these much further forward. They're identifying how we're going to monitor them, how we're going to manage them, and how we're going to implement them. So it's really become a very effective way to bring our different organisations together and have a sense of direction and a common purpose in terms of how we're going to address digital inclusion moving forward. Next slide, please. Just a quick recount on some of the things that we've already done. We've worked with organisations like the Digital Education Partnership, which identified over 5,000 young children in the city who had no access to internet connectivity or devices, and we've been working with them and provided over 2,000 devices with data where necessary to those young kids. We've supported in the rollout of the Computers for Pupils national scheme. Over 4,000 devices were supported. Internally, we've done work around getting devices out, and my colleague will talk about some of those. But we've also secured funding both from the public and the private sector to continue some of these programs. And we've set up a digital inclusion governance board, as I mentioned, which is really our foundations to enable that we're creating new opportunities and make sure there are new additional opportunities coming forward, and we continue to address the needs as they emerge rather than being reactive in the way we were before. Next slide, please. Okay, that's my presentation. I'm going to hand over to Emma Cole, who's the Commercial Director for IT. Thank you.
Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us this afternoon, whether you're actually online now with us or whether you're watching the recording afterwards. So as Raj said, you know, and he's talked about some fantastic work that we're doing here. What we wanted to just do very quickly was just bring one of those examples to life. And so the council's refreshed digital strategy incorporated a commitment to give citizens access to digital devices, and obviously this included access to computers and the means of accessing online resources. And so from that, what we've termed the Computers for Good Causes was born. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the background on how we got here, it's fair to say that the pandemic was obviously very much a catalyst to moving this forward at pace for us. No one could ignore just how big an issue we had in terms of digital inequality across the city as the pandemic hit us, and obviously it just shone a huge and welcome light over us and encouraged us to drive forward on this. And so we, like many organisations, we had a contract with a supplier in terms of disposal of all our old hardware. And this contract also, had provided us with, an important revenue stream to the council for quite a long time. But the combination of the pandemic, our corporate route to zero policy, and our desire to address the digital inequalities across the city made us realise that obviously a fundamental change was needed. And alongside everyone else, Birmingham had to react quickly due to the pandemic. At the start, we only had about 1,500 people with the ability to work from home. And so we had to mobilise in the region of 11,000 employees very quickly to give them the ability to work from home. And out of that, about 3,500 of those people had been using desktops up until that point in an office. So you can see we suddenly had a lot of spare hardware as we mobilised our work from home initiative. So when we started to look at this in more detail in terms of how we could directly help our citizens and all the local organisations we did have some discussions with some social enterprise companies who were already in that space in terms of cleansing and distributing hardware. And they were already working with other organisations in that respect. So they were all well respected. And we did start to progress with one specific organisation in terms of putting in place an agreement to supply them with our kits. But unfortunately, we couldn't reach what we thought was a mutually beneficial position on it. And so we decided we would pull away and do a pilot ourselves first to really see how difficult and how costly it would be, both to run it as an initial more big bang initiative, and also moving forward when the dust had settled a little bit. And of course, when we made this decision, I don't just mean it was in terms of the financial element. Yes, of course, we needed to find a way to engage at a minimum cost to Birmingham Council. But we also had a very, very clear Birmingham First principle that we wanted to push for. We wanted to be able to say that we were directly helping citizens and voluntary organisations within our city and sort of the neighbouring areas that we have. And whilst we appreciate that there is a need for both across the UK and overseas, our first priority, as I said, was to our citizens and our organisations. I wouldn't say that these third-party groups don't have their place, because quite clearly they do, but we found it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to put all our eggs in one basket in terms of that option. If you want to be able to control and direct where your hardware goes to. And clearly not everything can and should be repurposed. You know, we still evaluate each piece of hardware to establish if it's beyond its economic life. And if it is, we use our disposal contracts. But now in terms of these items are now in the minority rather than the majority. And so we're sending almost nothing across to places like China, which have, obviously been in the news around that sort of, route to zero policy. And it supports our carbon neutral and route to zero policies. Next slide, please. So for our stage 1 pilot, as Raj alluded to earlier, we took around the 650 mark of perfectly viable desktops that had been up until the pandemic used in the offices, with the intention of cleansing and redistributing them to courses across the city. We started by speccing out the requirements of what we thought our pilot needed to look like. We drafted a process. We looked at what our anticipated risks would be and what our considerations were. And also we looked at obviously the methods for cleansing the hardware. And this was all done in collaboration with our fantastic end user computing team that we have within Birmingham, and obviously had to be in line with the council security and data policies, which are obviously, for us, are really, really key. So we bulk purchased Blanco licenses, which are the licenses that we use to clean all the data off the machines, and they were just under £6 a license. They were, I don't know, something like £5.87 for each one. And because this was a pilot, we chose to look at ways where we could utilise our current end user computing staff, and I mean both in terms of our permanent staff and interims that we had in at the moment, to do the cleansing and the distribution. And then in parallel, we looked at how best to reach out to the citizens and the voluntary organisations within the city, and how to publicise our initiative. We needed to see how popular it was going to be, but also to find a way of funneling that interest from all these organisations through one single route. What we couldn't obviously do is have interest coming in from left, right, and centre. So as part of it all, I talked to council members, to gauge a feel from them. And I also got in touch with an organisation we have in Birmingham called the BVSC, which is the Birmingham Voluntary Service Council. And they have a wide reach in terms of the organisations that they work with. And they were absolutely fantastic at working with us. And together we set up an online sort of application process for organisations to come to us. And they helped us push out our comms, which set out what types of hardware we were currently looking at distributing, and the eligibility criteria, because again, we wanted to make sure that first of all it was Birmingham, the West Midlands, that we were catering for. And I have to say, we had the most fantastic and enthusiastic response to this shout out from almost 90 charitable stroke community group organisations within Birmingham and the West Midlands. And we invited them all to put in a request for the hardware volumes. And actually the requests exceeded demand, far more than the 650 initial laptops that we had. So we did have to adjust down in terms of what we could give people, but we obviously made the decision that was anything over a 10 or 15 unit. So we made sure that everybody got a minimum number that they'd asked for, unless they were over that number. And to ensure we were issuing appropriate organisations, we assessed all the applications, obviously, in terms of usage and in terms of the social benefit that they were planning to to use it for, because we needed to be comfortable that our hardware was going to benefit grassroots level and wasn't simply going to be used to sell on. That's clearly not acceptable to us. And we also, as part of it, we produced legal transfer documentation, which organisations were required to sign when they came in and accepted each of the groups of kit. Next slide, please. Okay. So at the last count, as I say, we have issued to about 85 charities and community groups at the moment. There were a couple that when they came in decided that they didn't want desktops and they were prepared to wait for any laptops in the future. So it was about 85 that we've issued out to for Birmingham and the surrounding areas. And these span a wide range of groups. And what I've done is I've just put a few of their logos up on the screen here. Obviously not enough room for 85, but but they include, so the charities include groups such as mental health organisations, physical disability support, refugee support, homeless support for the elderly, veterans, and some of them that you can see up there, the Walsall Society for the Blind, who actually was very personal to me because my father is partially sighted and actually benefits from the work that they do. We've got the Holborn organisation, which is all about keeping kids out of trouble using sport. Welcome Change is on there, and they look at drug and alcohol support. Rainy Day Trust, you can see, which is financial aid. They provide debt and legal advice. And then lastly, just to mention Noah Star, which is a family and sibling support type organisation for families with ill children, and it helps support not only the children themselves but the parents and any siblings. And then some of the community groups also that we had, as I've mentioned, support through sport groups, diaspora community organisations, religiously affiliated organisations and faith groups, and just a couple of those, the Zia Al Quran Mosque, who actually we visited, and the Integrate Theatre, which is a theatre for deaf and hearing adults. So these organisations either use the desktops in their central locations to help with training and learning, or in the case of some of the faith groups, also distributed them to families with children, as Raj alluded to earlier, where families have either got nothing at all, or they've got multiple children within the house, and they were all trying to use those pieces of kit that they had themselves. So, which was absolutely fantastic to see. Them being able to do that for their schoolwork, etc. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to bring this to life a little bit and just quickly show you some pictures of just some of the people who run these organisations. So these are the people at the heart of why we're doing this and why it's really important to us that we maximise this opportunity to get our initiative out into the public domain. In the hope that it's going to encourage more groups to contact us, so we can widen our reach, because we are going to be doing this again. We want to make it more long-term and more sustainable. And we want more organisations to come into us. So, as I say, initially we were just offering the desktop element of the hard drive, but as part of our office clearances under our New Ways of Working initiative, we were also able to increase that out. So we were able to also give monitors, peripherals, cables, etc., which means that the donations were far more useful. On this first pilot, we weren't providing the Microsoft software, but I am working on how we can potentially do things like that going forward. And so, simply put, if people in the community don't know about our initiative, we don't know that they need our help. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So the first couple of pictures on there show Dr. Peter Bishop, who's our Director of Digital and Customer Services, greeting a couple of organisations and handing over those desktops. And then the final picture is the visit to the Zia Al Quran Mosque and Community Centre that I visited with the Deputy Leader, Bridget Jones, and another couple of fellow councillors. And it was absolutely fantastic to see that, not only to see how our desktops have been supporting the community, but also how proud they are of the work that they do. What was supposed to be a half an hour visit to them turned into 2 hours. With samosas and everything provided. Absolutely fantastic, completely recommend it. And I really do wish that these groups were here on this call today so they could tell you the difference that receiving this hardware has made to them. And every single one of them is right now waiting for us to come back out and say we're doing the second round of donations. Also, just added to this, and I noticed that I think Mandy, you put in the chat a little while ago. It did give us the opportunity to publicise the council's social value initiative called Match My Project, which looks at pairing our suppliers with community organisations that need our help. None of these organisations that we spoke to were aware of them. So as part of what we were doing here, we also started to talk to them about the Match My Project, which was absolutely brilliant to be able to do. Next slide, thank you. So just quickly and to sort of close down. So what's next for us? I think the first thing for me to say is this is still very much a work in progress for us at the moment. It was our own pilot. We've learned a lot, but there is a lot more to come from it. And we've proved that we can provide this service directly to our citizens and organisations. But creating a repeatable service is very different to a one-off initiative. And that's what we want to provide, a BAU way of working to be able to continuously supply hardware across our city to those in need as they become available. So now we're in the process of sitting down as a small team to work through this repeatable process, and we want to obviously make it as self-funding as possible. We're looking at how our internal organisation can use resources such as graduates and apprentices as part of it, and our working assumption being is they can be trained within a week in terms of some of the processes around cleansing our hardware. And also get them out into the community as well to see and experience what we're talking about. So we're also engaging with our current suppliers and reaching out to large city organisations within Birmingham to see if we can leverage forms of sponsorship to fund licenses or apprenticeship roles that we can try and start to link into this initiative. And as I said, the BVSC were absolutely fantastic help on the pilot, but we're now looking at how we can widen that publicity, reach out to include not only them, but to publicise further and work with teams across the council to see who needs that help, work with schools, etc. So that's where linking with Raj and his team is fundamental to growing this. And we want multiple channels to feed into us, so that those who can't apply online can still get to us, and we can get them into that digital space. Of course, it can be mutually beneficial, in terms of our suppliers. So quite rightly, we've got a real focus on social value across the council, but many of our suppliers, and I think especially in the IT space, still struggle when it comes to articulating how they can really deliver grassroots social value under their contract, whether it be one that we've already got or whether it's one that comes in as part of a tender outwards. And very often they forget that social value benefit doesn't have to be a big bang. It can be loads of smaller but just as effective contributions that organisations make and work with us on. And I think this is where initiatives like this will start to come in. So stage 2 of this initiative is a further 4,000 desktops and up to 1,300 laptops. We're still in the process of assessing the viability of all of these machines, but I would have thought that we'll probably get a good 80 to 90% of this hardware in terms of numbers that we can move forward into cleansing and then out into the communities. And of course, once we've completed these 2 large-scale initiatives, we'll expect the number to drop down to a more steady state, and then we can use our refresh policy within the council in terms of desktops and laptops to forecast levels of hardware going through this cycle. And this is where it becomes more manageable for us on a day-to-day basis, but also we need to make sure that we don't use that as an opportunity to let the initiative slip, which is why it's so important to work out how we're going to make this a long-term initiative. So there's just one final request from me, really. That's my presentation, but my one final request really is that anybody who's listening now or who's listening to the recorded version of this, I'd be really interested if anyone listening has been through a similar process, is going through it now, has any ideas or suggestions they can share with us. We're happy to also share. And if you do, my contact details were on the slide at the start of this, and I'd love to hear from people to be able to compare notes and avoid pitfalls, etc. Or if you've got any contacts that you think would be really handy for us. So with that, thank you for your time today on this, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to both Raj and myself. I'm now handing back to Matthew in case there's any questions that may have come in whilst we've been talking. So thank you, everyone.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, both of you. And Emma, you swiftly dealt with a question that had come in the chat as well, so I won't bring that one up again. But
good, thank you.
If I go back to almost to the beginning, really, and a question for you, I think, Raj, really. They ask, how is the implementation of the digital inclusion strategy going? And they kind of follow it up by asking about how are the roadmap actions being delivered?
Yes, thank you for that, Matthew. Yes, the answer to that is it's going well. One of the things that we did do was to make sure that we recruited the team. So we now have the full team in place. That will support both the council and the communities out there to make sure that we are bringing these actions together and supporting the different organisations to enable some of the implementation of these actions to take place. That was the first thing we did. The second thing that we've done, and I think it's really important, which shows the buy-in from city partners and city stakeholders, is brought together that stakeholder governance group. And we have our second meeting this Friday that brings together voluntary sector organisations, some of the big corporates who have got resources, who are putting connectivity in, and all sorts of other activities through that. And we've got a number of other voluntary sector, university partners, and small SMEs who are all coming together to take ownership of some of those actions. So the initial answer to that is it's going well. We've made sure in the approach we've adopted is that this is a collective approach where different organisations will take the lead. And what we've certainly seen is that many organisations have stepped up, taken the actions that have been identified and said, I will take ownership of this, and have gone away and started developing plans to actually implement them. So really good steps so far, really positive, really good buy-in from the city stakeholders and state partners. So fingers crossed, this is something that will embed as part of something that the city will do and not rely on individual partners to take these actions further forward.
Brilliant, thanks, Raj. And look, while I've got you, there's another one that's come in. It asks about or how are you supporting the most vulnerable in our communities?
So yes, we've certainly recognised that some of our most vulnerable are the ones that probably use our services the most and are probably most visible, most invisible, and difficult to get hold of and support. And certainly in some of the early mapping work we've done, we've identified those people in social housing, for example, are extremely vulnerable. They don't often get access to the internet services. Some of it's because they've got various personal conditions that enables them not to get access. So what we've been working with the market and different organisations to provide broadband connectivity into those tower blocks and look at deals that are well below commercial rates and give them special opportunities, look to see how we can actually make those packages cheaper and affordable and in a way that they want to use them rather than tie them into contracts. And that's something that, again, some of the big organizations have really stepped up and have started looking at different ways of providing those packages. So yes, we've had that focus on social housing, but the other focus that we've had, and this is really down to working with our partners again and Birmingham Education Partnerships, we've been working through the schools to identify those young kids who've really suffered as a result of the pandemic, not having the right connectivity, not having the right devices. We've tried to work through them and identify those families and made sure those young kids have got access to devices through our program. So yes, that's really how we're tackling the most vulnerable, because we recognise it's not just the elderly, it is all sorts of different groups across the city that really needs this support.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks, and I think that goes some way to answering a kind of follow-up as well, which was about how you're going about improving connectivity for those communities as well. And you kind of wrap those together nicely there. Emma, one for you, talking about, of course, no one ever wants to talk about what you're doing. They want to talk about what you're going to do. So what are the next steps for you following on from the Computer for Causes initiative?
What in terms of well, I've talked about what we'll be doing in terms of the Computers for Good Causes. I think for me it's really important that we get that right first. Before we actually start to to look too much at other things. But as I talked about on our slide, it's all about making this repeatable. So what we've got is we've got workshops. We're looking at graduates and apprentices. We're reaching out in terms of the comms. We're going to be doing a lot around that supplier, tapping into that supplier sponsorship and social value. So I want to make sure that what we're doing is we're putting we're putting that all in properly in terms of that Computers for Good Causes first, and then and make it. These things need to be self-funding, as much as we can, and by making it self-funding, we need to collaborate and we need to work with people. But also, I think using things like graduates and apprentices, we're teaching them the right thought process as well, in terms of working in terms of digital inclusion and how we need to bridge that gap for everybody.
Oh, thanks, Emma. And I think also that question may have come in before you put that slide up with the numbers on as well. The thousands of units.
I mean, this is it. We have, because of the change in the way that we all work now, and the fact that people do, our staff now have laptops. We do have a huge number to be able to recycle. That's obviously not going to continue, but it's really important that we can get those out into the community as much as we can.
And I think you touched on this in your last answer as well. There's another question for you. How are we encouraging our commercial partners to support and match our contribution that we make in terms of the social value?
So, as I've sort of said, we need to make it easier for our commercial partners to work with us. And as I alluded to, I think sometimes in the IT space that hasn't necessarily been very easy. I think our suppliers sometimes struggle, and I think there's been too much focus on that sort of that they've got to come in with that big bang approach, and that can be hard for suppliers to sign up to and articulate in their proposals. So I think we need to get much more on the social value front if we take that little and often approach. I'd rather have a supplier committing to a long-term set of initiatives or financial contributions or sponsorship, I'd rather be able to see, them committing, rather than doing sort of one sort of big bang and then not having to do anything for the rest of their contract. To have that constant thing from them, and also that is less of a burden on them on a day-to-day basis. So we're, as I said, we're currently doing a big push to all our suppliers to encourage them to visit and utilise Birmingham's new Match My Project site, which is where the community organisations and suppliers get matched together to complete projects. An organisation will say, we really need this, we really need help with this, and our suppliers can go on and say, well, we're specialists in that, we can help. And also it gets recorded, so we can see as a local authority what contribution, and we can measure a lot more easier what social value and corporate responsibility help that we've been getting from our suppliers.
Fantastic, thanks, Emma. And Raj, have you got time for one more question?
Yes.
It's I think it's somebody asking you to expand on something that you mentioned. What is community-led innovation, and how are you creating opportunities for the communities through it?
That's a really good question, and what we've recognised is certainly in communities there is lots of exciting activities happening, lots of local projects that are addressing local needs and targeted at the right people. And what we wanted to do as part of this process is see how we create the right platform for them to engage with corporate organisations and other organisations that might have a funding pot that would want to drive some of those things. And yes, CSR is one opportunity, and Match My Project is another one. And what we've been trying to do is to make sure that platform is there, so that when an organisation comes in, wants to invest, has some social activities that it wants to do, it would expose a lot of those activities that are happening in that community, and that we can engage them both from a bottom-up approach and from a top-down to ensure there is a funding stream for them to enable to continue those activities and really have a long-term impact on their community there. So that's what we mean by that sort of community innovation-led approach, where we're looking at the community to come up with the ideas, come up with approaches, and for us to work with them to see how we can fund them and ignite them to make them be deliverable.
Smashing. Thanks, Rich. Thank you. And Emma, one more question for you, I think, if there's time. I think there is, isn't there? So this person asks about changing the way they say digital and IT services procure kit. How are you embedding or building sustainable CSR? I don't know what that is, into what we do.
Okay, so we're always looking at the most cost-effective way to procure our hardware, and about how sustainable and how that fits in with our corporate responsibilities. As I mentioned earlier, around the the disposal contract, we're very mindful about all of those things now. So we'll be looking to leverage contracts that have a much clearer a sustainable policy around a lot of those things. And we have a contract in place at the moment with our catalogue services that's constantly monitored in terms of all of those things. In terms of new contracts for bespoke work and projects, sort of as you would expect, we build our corporate responsibility and our social values in as part of our requirements, and we score them as part of any evaluations. Of course, we can't always get everything we want all the time, but we make a conscious effort to focus on that. And where we can't, or we can't get something where we want to, we go away and try and understand the reasons for that, and we can talk to our our suppliers, our partners, and organisations in the IT sector that we don't yet work with, to see if there's something that can help fit a little bit more than that. So it's not a big bang in terms of that change. It's a constant in terms of how we assess them, how we assess the market. It's about knowing our market, knowing our suppliers, and some of the teams that we have are fundamental to that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma, indeed, for that explanation too. corporate social responsibility. It must be.
Yes,
thank you.
sorry, I should have
Got it.
for you.
No, if I can work that out, I reckon we've all got a chance. That leaves us with a few minutes to spare. I don't know if either of you want to come back with anything. I think we've got a bit of time, Raj, there for you to kind of finish us off, I think.
I suppose for me, it's really just to say a big thank you, which I should have done at the beginning, to a lot of the community organisations out there and our stakeholders who have helped pulling together the digital inclusion strategy, and plus other local authorities. I mean, what we did do is speak to lots of other local authorities to see how they've approached it. We took lessons and learnings from them, and I think that whole collaboration piece has been absolutely fantastic throughout the pandemic, where different organisations have shared some of their opportunities, shared their ideas with us, and we've shared our ideas with them. That makes us really good opportunity for that collaboration to take place and a lots of learning. So real big thank you out there. And if there are organisations out there or people out there that want to have a look at our digital inclusion strategy, by all means, the links are there in the presentation, or contact myself or Emma to get some further details of either of these two projects. We're happy to work with you out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Raj. Okay, well, thank you everybody for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. We'll get the recording out on the various social platforms. Thanks so much for your time today. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye.